Hey everyone, hell has frozen over. The end of days are upon us. Nvidia has just released support for FreeSync, or more specifically, their G-Sync brand has been expanded to include compatibility for adaptive sync displays, official support or unofficial support depending on the monitor. The word is that Nvidia has tested 400 FreeSync monitors and given full G-Sync compatibility ratings to just 12 of them. However, connects up any variable refresh display to an Nvidia GPU now with the latest driver, and the option is there to enable support, and that's exactly what I did using this, a lowly Asus VP28U. It's an entry-level 28-inch TN 4K display with FreeSync compatibility. And yeah, it's a pretty basic implementation, but it does work and you can get some good results. Right then, so let's talk about how it works. Variable refresh is super important because it lets the GPU take control of when a new frame is displayed on the monitor. Without it, you have two options: VSync on, VSync off. VSync active on a standard 60Hz display. Well, to get a consistent refresh, you need a game to run at either 60 frames per second locked, one display refresh, or 30 frames per second, with each frame then persisting for 2 refreshes. FreeSync and G-Sync put the GPU in control of when a new frame is put on the screen, meaning no more tearing or VSync judder when performance isn't locked. But on bargain basement FreeSync screens like mine, there's a limitation. Variable refresh is only active between 40 to 60 Hz, meaning that for the effect to work, you need to keep your frame rate within 40 to 60 frames per second. G-Sync adds a lot of additional features to stabilize the experience if you fall out of the VRR window. It is the premium option, no doubt about it. It is better, but obviously there's a price premium to match on display hardware that uses it. So in this video, I'm going to show you how 4K gameplay is improved with FreeSync technology. We're pushing so many pixels here that frame rates can vary dramatically. So variable refresh, VRR, is a bit of a game changer, as we shall discover. Now, we can't capture a VRR video signal, and even if we could, you couldn't display it on your screen. So we're going old school here, pointing a camera at the screen. You should still be able to see the smoothness, the fluidity, and I've got frame rate and frame time counters active, so you can compare the experience to the measured performance level there in the top right. Okay, so let's flip over to the system that I'm testing here. Okay then, so this is the system I'm going to be using for testing. I've got the basic system outline here. We have the Core i7-8086K here. 6 cores, 12 threads. This has a 5 GHz overclock in place. Let's go and look into the device manager. The GPU I've chosen here, Nvidia GeForce GTX 1080 Ti. I was thinking of doing a 4K test with the RTX 2080 Ti, but it actually turned out that most games generally tend to run at 60 frames per second at 4K anyway on that GPU. So we're going to go a bit lower, but at the same time, it's a GPU that more people are likely to own. So there's quite a lot of value in that, I think. Msi Afterburner here, and you can see that, yes, it's the GeForce GTX 1080 Ti, very latest driver with the VRR support and no overclocking. It's on standard settings there. And let's bring up the Nvidia control panel, and you can see that it's identified my cheap Asus VP28U monitor, and the G-Sync dialog is open, and I can just enable it there. Good to go. So here we are, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, our first port of call. We're going to instantly dip into the visual settings here to see what's what. And as you can see there, 3840 by 2160 4K. Moving into the graphics settings. Okay, so we've got a custom preset here, but it is essentially the high setting, and I've moved anisotropic filtering up to 16 times and HBAO Plus for enhanced ambient occlusion. So yeah, GTX 1080 Ti can't run this at 4K 60 on highest settings, but high with these individual tweaks, well, again, it's not going to be able to get you to 60 frames per second, but it's going to keep you within the 40 to 60 frames per second VRR window of this particular monitor. So yeah, basically, if you're between 40 to 60 frames per second, you will get the benefit of the adaptive sync technology. And there we are, 44 frames per second after a bit of stutter there at the beginning, 45. So yeah, it's actually looking really, really smooth here. I mean, it just wouldn't present like this if you had VSync off or if you had VSync on. Technology is working as it should here. Now, one thing I want to point out, next to the frame rate counter there's the millisecond counter. And this is actually more important. The VRR window might be 40 to 60 frames per second, but it's actually the millisecond equivalent, 16.7 milliseconds to 25 milliseconds. This is crucially important because frame times can exceed the 25 millisecond window and your frame rate is kind of averaged across multiple frames. So what will happen there is that you will get momentary stutter even though the frame rate counter could conceivably be in the low 40s. But yeah, keep an eye on that frame time reading there. 25 milliseconds, you want to kind of tweak your settings so you kind of give yourself a bit of leeway there. But overall, I mean, we're at 42, 43 frames per second on this jungle excerpt of the benchmark here. Looks pretty good. Now the final leg of this benchmark is interesting because it will start at 60 frames per second in a non-complex area of the scene. But as we dip down into the valley and we get more highly detailed areas, you'll notice that the frame rate starts to dip. But this is actually a good test of how general consistency in frame times is more important than the actual frame rate. So yeah, we're actually down to what, 46 frames per second now, 45, but it's still looking really, really smooth. And this just demonstrates that it's all about consistency here. It's about staying within the VRR window and also having kind of level frame times across frames. So Crysis 3, here we are, 2013 game. We still use it for benchmarking for two reasons. First of all, it stresses both CPU and GPU, though I think an 8086K at 5 GHz should be alright on the CPU side. GPU side though, 1080 Ti can't sustain 4K 60 on max settings here. And just to confirm, going into the settings, again, 4K resolution, SMAAT2X anti-aliasing, which is perfectly fine for a 4K, it's perfectly fine across the board really. System spec, actually we're going to move that up to very high, which is everything maxed. So yeah, let's move back into the game. And yeah, pretty interesting results here, 45, 51, 56, 58 frames per second. We're within the VRR window and it's, you know, it's feeling pretty good. Now we're in a first person shooter here, which the consistency is really important here. So when we spin around, it kind of looks good. You know, you're not seeing any jerking or stuttering that you'd get with VSync, and no tearing of course. And the frame rates are actually varying between 49 to 56 frames per second. So yeah, this is pretty good stuff all told. It just feels, you know, I'm not going to say it's identical to a locked 60 frames per second because obviously we're moving within, I don't know, 16 to 21 millisecond frame times there, but it's really hard to tell the difference, especially with joypad, which is what I'm using here in order to get consistent movement. This is pretty good actually. I mean, the response is pretty awesome. You can see the consistency is there, and we're well within the VRR window. We can actually stress test this a bit by moving to this area here and maybe blowing something up. Yeah, 42, 43, 44 frames per second, but it still works. It's still pretty good. Now, usually when I tweak for graphics settings, I want 60 all the time. So what's happening here is that I don't need to adjust for the worst case scenario, the 42 frames per second there. I can just let VRR do the heavy lifting and I retain the graphical fidelity here, which is pretty awesome. But let's say you do feel the difference in consistency. We're on max settings here. Let's pop into the options, advanced graphics, one setting here, moving shading from very high to high. Everything else is still very high. Now we're actually sort of mostly at 60 frames per second here. So VRR takes on a different role here. What it does is essentially irons out the small inconsistencies you'll get when you're below 60 frames per second. It's basically impossible to tell the difference, whereas the tiny stutters that you would get if you weren't using FreeSync VRR, then yeah, basically they're totally gone. You know, it's just a beautifully consistent experience here. So yeah, not too bad. So let's see whether we can dent the frame rate here and kind of see if we can budge that 60 FPS, put VRR through its paces a bit more. So here we go. Even blowing stuff up is it's holding remarkably steady. So if you want to optimize this game, well, there we go. So yeah, 49, 48, 43. So yeah, this is not the typical performance profile of Crysis 3, very high settings, high shading. But VRR is doing the heavy lifting for that kind of, less than 1% of the time where the frame rate is under 60 there. Just smooths out the entire experience, and yeah, pretty awesome. So yes, VRR FreeSync on an Nvidia card. I'd say that this is acting exactly the way it should be if it were running on a Radeon card. I mean, I've tested this monitor with a Radeon Vega 64. Acts exactly like this. The difference being that obviously AMD doesn't have a card yet until the Radeon 7 comes out that can compete with the GTX 1080 Ti. So yeah, we're able to tap into the FreeSync screens here with technology that was previously not compatible with it, which I just think is great. Should have happened a lot sooner, but I'm glad it's happened now. Okay, so we're going to return to another of our legacy favorites here, Assassin's Creed Unity. If you want to max this game out at 4K resolution, it will still bring an RTX 2080 Ti to its knees, mostly because of multi-sampling. I'm just going to confirm the settings first of all. Basically ultra high across the board, but we've got FXAA instead of the multi-sampling options, which are pretty intense. So let's continue the game and see what's what. Okay, 50 frames per second here, so we are well within the VRR window, dropping a bit of performance there. If we do that spinning around, that panning, again, you'll notice that it's really, really smooth there. If you look at the frame time reading there next to the frame rate on RivaTuner, again, the persistence per frame is pretty solid. That's really what you want when it comes to dealing with a VRR display. It's not so much the frame rate that's important, it's the persistence. It's keeping performance as consistent as you can. That really gets the most out of the screen. So what I'm going to do now is dip into our benchmark area, sequence 3, memory 2, and this is the Notre Dame square. So yeah, it's interesting here. The depth of field effect kills performance. It really is quite insane. If we skip into gameplay here, which is obviously the most important thing, we are well within the VRR window here. I think 50 to 60 is kind of the sweet spot, but I think on a third-person game like this with pretty laggy controls anyway, you can afford to actually go into like the mid-40s here, as we're doing here, and still get a really smooth experience. And yeah, it's working out pretty well here. Actually, let's push things a bit harder by actually going into Notre Dame Square, where performance can really, really tank if you really push things here on the settings. So, it's working out all right there. Again, keep an eye on that frame rate persistence there. Still within the window here. It's working out pretty well. Now, one thing that I did notice when I tested this earlier is that if we actually move out of the square here, I'm not sure why, possibly because of the volumetrics, we can actually move perilously close to the, there we go, 41 frames per second, to the bottom of the VRR window. And that is not good. But, we're still within it. It's still working out pretty good. One thing I will say, again, when you're at the bottom of the VRR window, as we were back then in kind of like low 40s, well, here's the thing. You kind of, we're right on the cusp of it there. Yeah, you can actually see, now this is interesting. When the frame time is above 25 milliseconds, you'll start to see stutter creeping in there. And it's not pretty. It's kind of just in and out depending on whether RivaTuner picks it up. It's not actually sampling every single frame, but you can see that we are moving in and out of the VRR window there. Mostly though, things are holding up pretty well on this title. And the experience here is so much better than the alternatives, which are of course having really ugly tearing or basically VSync judder. So there we go. Okay, so I am going to move on to a first-person shooter next. To see what we can do there. We're going to pick a fairly challenging game, I think, Battlefield 5. 1080 Ti, I'm kind of curious about this one because this card handles Frostbite games really, really nicely anyway. So let's dip into one of the more testing campaign levels and see what we can see. Okay, so this is the Provence level that caused so many problems for optimization when I was trying to get a locked 1080p 60 with the RTX 2060 with ray tracing enabled. And well, this is 4K. Let's just check the settings here. 3840 by 2160 confirmed. All of the post-processing effects down there are on. Advanced settings, DirectX 12 enabled, and everything is set to ultra. So yeah, good stuff there. And let's dip into actual gameplay. You know, we're still mostly at 60 frames per second here, so similar to what we saw with Crysis 3 earlier. VRR, FreeSync, G-Sync if you like, it's all acting here as a kind of almost like an insurance policy to ensure consistency when you do dip beneath 60 frames per second. So it's time to blow up that tank there. I'm going to take that Panzerfaust and let the carnage begin essentially. So let's see what we can do here. You can see here that the advanced effects work of dealing with the tank there, it's starting to cause frame rate drops. And I've got to say, I can't really notice the difference here. So it's whoopsie daisy. I did notice that. That was a frame time spike when the guy with a flamethrower was trying to take me out. But generally, as long as we stick within that window, yeah, everything's pretty cool. See if we can finish off that tank there before we continue. Yep, job done. So yeah, essentially, this is all good stuff. I can retain ultra settings here. I don't need to tweak for worst case scenarios as I had to do with Battlefield ray tracing. But yeah, this is why VRR is so cool. What's happening here is that I no longer need to optimize settings for the worst case scenarios as such, because you know, when the effects are really piling up, we're still within the variable refresh window. Everything still works great. And yeah, there is, obviously there will be a touch less response because the frame times are higher. But in terms of smoothness and consistency, it all works beautifully. Overall then, I'd say that this is a success, and I kind of wish I had this technology available for the RTX 2060 ray tracing testing that I did earlier. Okay, so after that exhaustive testing, what's the takeaway then? Well, essentially, FreeSync support is now a G-Sync option on Nvidia cards. My monitor here would never ever pass Nvidia's stringent tests for a premium VRR experience. But it's still fairly easy to work within the limitations and still massively improve the way a game looks and feels when frame rate is variable. But on bargain basement displays without low frame rate compensation, super important to keep within that VRR window. Any bugs? Well, the RTX 2080 Ti I tested had some issues with Shadow the Tomb Raider running with TAA active. Not a problem on the 1080 Ti though, weirdly. While pretty frequently my screen would show up like this after booting. Looks like this 4K screen is using two 1920 by 2160 tiles over DisplayPort, and one of them gets deactivated. It's easy to fix by swapping resolution down to 1600p then back up to 4K, but it is a bit annoying as it does happen quite a lot. But on a higher level, I'm interested in why this is happening right now, this new Nvidia support. I think it's about time, simply because variable refresh rate will become more common. It'll move to next-gen HDMI 2.1 living room TVs, and if Nvidia isn't compatible there, that'll be a very bad thing. In the meantime, now you have a choice. Buy a G-Sync display for a fully featured VRR experience, or choose a cheaper FreeSync alternative which may or may not have full G-Sync certification. My screen doesn't. It's extremely basic, and you do really need to be aware of the limitations. But if you are and adapt settings to accommodate, I think it still looks pretty fantastic. So what would I like to see next? Well, that would be support for variable refresh for GeForce cards over HDMI. Right now, DisplayPort only. I don't know, maybe Nvidia is waiting for HDMI 2.1 displays to arrive to ensure full compatibility with the latest screens. But anyway, that's all from me for now. You all know what to do by now, surely. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell for instant notifications whenever we post new Digital Foundry content. And if you want to help the team more directly, please consider the DF Patreon. Everything we make is available to our patrons at pristine quality for just $5 a month, and there's a massive library of over 2 years worth of content with no download limitations. Anyway, thanks for making it all the way to the end, if indeed you did, and just generally, thanks for watching.